Well, good evening. Y'all very quiet, subdued tonight. Huh? You're not used to me being here. I wasn't here Sunday. Now, what if we turn that logic around to ever? Oh, then you get. I wasn't here Sunday. I was in Knoxville, and we even had an elder and his family that chased us down and made sure we went to church on Sunday morning. So, and then went to eat lunch with us, make sure we didn't gluttonize ourselves afterwards. So, but anyway, it was a good trip and a little more exciting than it needed to be. But anyway, that's part of it, I guess. If you'll turn to Revelation chapter 12, we are in Revelation. I forgot to plug in the thing into my computer. Tucker, I'm sorry. We're in Revelation chapter 12, and I told you last week at the end of class that Revelation 12 is one of my favorite chapters in Revelation for a couple of reasons. You know, at the end of that ball game the other night, because it was a victory for the good guys, we would say, hopefully we would all say that, there was celebration. So I'm going to see how much celebration there is at the end of chapter 12 here between all of us. But it's also one of my favorites because, it's also one of my favorites because, and I've told y'all this, sometimes the book of Revelation just comes right out and tells you this is symbolism, and this is one of those cases in which it does. Oh, you need an adapter. That's what you need. No. I do. Excuse us while we have technical difficulty. This is what happens when I don't check everything out before I get started like I should and am supposed to. And of course I can't find it right off the cuff. Well, I'd hate for you to have to do that. Because I know I've got one in here somewhere. Behold, I thought. Have you heard that before? Behold, I thought. I did. Here it is. There it goes. Anyway, I've told you sometimes Revelation just comes right out and tells you this is a symbol or this is a sign. And in Revelation 12, he does that with a couple of things. And so it's kind of cool to me in the fact that we're going to see some things here, especially that the vision that he's having here is he's going to tell you right off the bat that this is something that symbols, signifies, or represents something else, and we'll talk a little bit about what that is as we go along. So in chapter 12 and verse 1 of Revelation, it says, "A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars." So here the woman, he says, is depicted as a sign or a symbol that represents another reality. Later on in this chapter, he's going to tell us about a great red dragon that he says represents something. And that's important because, as I mentioned at the end of class last week, there are some things that we've talked about, like the one sitting on the great throne. He didn't say that's a symbol. That's a reality. The four living creatures around, he didn't say that's a symbol. There's four living creatures. But these are things that he tells us represent something else. The woman and the dragon are. So what is she? Well, he says she's clothed with the sun. The moon is under her feet. On her head is a crown of 12 stars. And the crown here is the Stephanos, which is the victory crown. Remember, we talked about earlier in the book of Revelation, there's two words for crown in the Greek language. One is Stephanos, which is kind of, if you think about the depictions you've probably seen of the old Greek Roman games, the olive branch crown that they would put on, kind of like the gold medal. This was the victory crown that they had for them. The other is diadem. We sing about that sometimes in some of our songs, the royal diadem. A diadem is a royal crown like a king would wear. And we're going to see that, by the way, here in just a little bit. But this woman has on a victory crown. So there's one clue. If she is victorious, then who does she belong to? God. That's right. The other thing is, it says that she has 12 stars. Her crown is of 12 stars. Well, 12 we've talked about. Here's another one of those 12s, and he's 12'd us to death in places. But we've talked about that 12 represents things that, or people that, or items that belong to God. So here is a woman that is representing the victorious that belong to God. Now, think back into the Old Testament, as we call it, the Hebrew Scriptures. Were there ever any point in time where God's people was depicted or described as a woman? This is yes. This is no. This is I don't know. Yes, daughters of Zion, they're called. How many times in the Old Testament does God, through the prophets especially, talk about Israel as being married to God, espoused to God, and then she has committed spiritual adultery? So God's people have often been, and by the way, we've talked about this, and I'll keep bringing it up because I never know who's popping in and out in the class, but if for no other reason, just to keep it fresh on your mind, and when we get through with the book of Revelation, maybe you'll remember that if nothing else. But so much of this imagery that we see in the book of Revelation, it's sometimes difficult for us because we don't have any type of literature like apocalyptic literature with all of this representative kind of stuff in our culture today. But it's also maybe a little bit difficult for us because almost everything that he talks about in the book of Revelation, there is, and you've probably seen this by now after 11 chapters of this, almost all of it references back to some sort of imagery used in the Hebrew Scriptures. Imagery and passages that the people he's writing to would have understood and knew. And so when they read certain things that he's going to talk about in Revelation, their mind would have automatically gone back to Ezekiel or to Jeremiah or wherever it might have been, and they would have thought how that imagery was used there, and then they would have translated, oh, that's what he means here, see, or the same kind of concept. So anyway, that's the idea here, is this woman who belongs to God because of this crown, this Stephanos, victory crown and the 12 stars. And so it seems from that and what's going to follow in this chapter pretty apparent that she symbolizes the people of God before and after Jesus. And there's two women used symbolically in the book of Revelation. There's this beautiful woman of chapter 12, and then later on we get to chapters about 17 or 18. There's the great harlot that we're gonna see, and those two will be contrasted a little bit. But verse 2, it says, she was pregnant and was crying out in birth pains and the agony of giving birth. Now, if you read some commentators or listen to some quote-unquote scholars, they're going to tell you that this woman is Mary, But remember what he said in verse 1 about this woman. She is a symbol, not a real woman. Okay? So again, this is God's people before and after Jesus. And she's pregnant. She's crying out in birth pains, the agony of giving birth. By the way, you may or may not know, but Nathan and Chelsea are at the hospital right now. I've been texting Nathan all day because I knew better than to text Chelsea to see how things were going. Some of you women, I noticed women laughed at that, none of the guys did, because you all knew better to laugh at that, right? But anyway, what he describes, these birth pains and the agony of giving birth, the word that's translated agony there literally means torture. She's going through the torture of giving birth. And so the child that she's going to bear is the promised seed of Abraham, the promised seed of David, that would be the Messianic King, the Christ, that's going to come from God's people. Okay? Jesus wasn't born to, the Amalekites or to the Greeks or to whoever. He was born, came from the lineage that came from Abraham. Verse 3, and now another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon. This is almost getting like Lord of the Rings kind of stuff, isn't it? A great red dragon, and look, here's the description of him, with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his head 7 diadems. The ESV doesn't translate the word diadem. It transliterates it, gives it English letters for the Greek letters to make a new word to distinguish that it's a different kind of crown that this has on it. And you may be thinking, I've seen a dragon like that in movies I've watched. Well, I'm convinced all of the good storylines come from the Bible. They're just Hollywood's stealing them and using them for their own purposes. But not a separate vision. These are the 2 main characters in this vision. There is this beautiful woman who is going through the birth process, who's pregnant and having a baby, and then there's this red dragon, and he's wearing on his head these diadems. Again, this is the royal crown or the kingly crown. This is someone who is ruling and reigning on the earth. And I love it again when the Bible does the work for you. If you jump down to verse 9, he tells us in verse 9 exactly who this great dragon is. In verse 9, he says that this great dragon is Satan, and he's going to be thrown down in verse 9. But notice that he has 10 horns, and we learned back in Daniel chapter 8 that horns were the sign of power. So if he has 10 horns, 10 means complete. He has complete power at that time, okay? And the lamb is going to, when the lamb, you say the description of the lamb, he has 7 horns, and 7 means perfection. So I don't know how many of y'all know how to play poker and some of those kind of things. None of you would probably admit it right now, but I really don't. Somebody tried to teach me one time, and I couldn't keep up with what beat what, So I wasn't too successful playing poker very much, but this is one of those that would throw you off. You would think 10 beats 7, but this is one occasion when a 7 will beat a 10, okay? 7 is perfection, and 10 is complete, but perfection is going to beat completion. So anyway, he's got 10 horns and these 7 crowns, and like the beast that we're going to see in chapter 13, the dragon's got 7 heads and 10 horns, and so we ought to draw a parallel between the symbol of this dragon that we know is Satan and back to the 4th beast of Daniel chapter 7 and verse 7. And then in verse 4, he says, his tail swept away 1/3 of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he might devour it. She gave birth to a male child, one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron, but her child was caught up to God and to His throne. So, I've also been honest with you throughout our study of Revelation of times when I really don't know what he's talking about. And the idea of the vision here about the stars is a little bit difficult. Back in chapter 1 in verse 20, there were 7 stars that represented the messengers or the angels of the 7 churches. The woman had a crown of 12 stars. But now he says the dragon is said to drag a third of the stars down to earth. And not sure exactly what that might be. Back in chapter 6, in the midst of God's terrible judgments upon the earth, the stars of heaven fell to the earth, but it was involved in His judgment. So any interpretation any might have would be purely speculative, because the Bible doesn't really tell us what this represents. But maybe because of what he's going to talk about in chapter 12 and verse 9 about the dragon, Satan, being thrown down, and a third of the stars of heaven were cast down to the earth. Maybe that's representing the fallen angels that were gathered with Satan against God's people. That's, I think, I don't know, but speculation. But anyway, but what we do know is, and you can kind of picture this scene, this woman is in the agony of childbirth. She's delivering a baby, and right there beside her is this dragon crouched, ready to devour, to swallow, to eat up the baby. That's what he wants. So who's the baby? Well, if you hold your finger there, if you turn over in your Bibles to Psalm 2, and we looked at Psalm 2 as we were studying through chapter 11, but Psalm 2 is a messianic psalm that talks about the Lord's anointed. And someone, if you would, read for us Psalm 2 and verse 9. When you get over there. All right, this is what God the Father is telling His anointed, that you're going to rule with a rod of iron. Well, again, we may not think Psalm 2 when we see rule with a rod of iron, but that's what they would have immediately thought of is Psalm 2. And back earlier in Revelation chapter 2, we saw this as well. So, this child that is being born is Jesus the Christ. Okay? So, the woman is God's people, and the baby, Jesus, being born from God's people, is the Christ that they have been waiting for. And He's ready to devour it up. And then she gives birth to this male child, and He's going to rule, but it says her child, Satan wants to, the devil, the dragon, wants to devour him, wants to destroy him, but before he can, he was caught up to God and His throne. Now, when was Jesus caught up to God and His throne? Well, right after His crucifixion, after the resurrection, when He was ascended back into heaven. So we don't think of Jesus being born and then ascending to heaven, but we're covering a big span of time here in just a little bit. But that's the idea, is before He could destroy him, Jesus ascended back to God and the throne where He belonged. Then in verse 6 it says, "And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, in which she is to be nourished for 1,260 days." So the dragon is unsuccessful in his attack on the woman's child. So he turns his attention toward the woman. I can't destroy the child, so I'm going to destroy the woman. And the woman is God's people. All right? So remember what we've been talking about all along. Revelation has been written to the church who's being persecuted, right? He's telling us what has been happening. Okay? This vision, the woman, God's people, which would have been before the birth of Jesus, Israel, from God's people, from this woman comes this child that would be born that would rule with a rod of iron. The dragon, Satan, the devil, wants to devour him, destroy him, but before he can, he ascends back to God and the throne. If I can't destroy Jesus, I'm going to destroy the ones that are part of his family. Right? Like, Matt's not here, so I can talk about him. They're on vacation. But there's no way I could whoop Matt Valley. Y'all are all laughing. You didn't have to agree with me that quickly. But no way I could whoop Matt Valley. I think, don't tell her I said so, Kathy. I think I could take Jesse. I may not could, but I think I could. Maybe not. Addie Kate, maybe I could take. Of course, I'm sure Matt would say like I would about Gannon, if you did take her, you might bring her back later. I don't know. But anyway, that's what he's doing. I can't destroy Jesus, but I can destroy the ones he loves. And that's what he's going to do. So, again, it's not talking about Mary. It's talking about the true people of God from which the Messiah came and those who continue to serve the Messiah. And this idea of fleeing into the wilderness, but God is going to take care of her, again, that we talked about last week about the different prophets and the things that they were doing. Well, think about like Elijah. Whenever Jezebel tries to destroy Elijah, what did he do? He ran to the wilderness and God took care of him. Remember? The angel brought him the meal under the bush, and it was enough to sustain him, one meal for 40 days. I've eaten a lot of big meals. I've never had 40 days and 40 nights that meal sustained him. And he goes to the cave and he thinks he's the only one, and God encourages him and says, you're not alone. You think you are, but you're not. There's still work to do and people to anoint and all sorts of things. And you think back to like the children of Israel, when they fled out of Egypt, they ended up in the wilderness. And first it was Pharaoh and his army that's pursuing them, and then it's all these other people that are pursuing them, trying to destroy them, but God always took care of them, didn't he? Provided for them what they needed, the manna and the quail and water from the rock and all that. But notice it says she's going to be nourished for 1,260 days. So that's the same amount of time. Remember, 1,260 days is the same as 42 months or 3.5 years or times and half a time and all that. That's the same amount of time back up in chapter 11 that the persecution of God's people was going to last. In chapter 11 and verse 2, it was the same amount of time that he was going to allow his prophets to preach in chapter 11 and verse 3. Same time period. So seems to be he's talking about the same thing, right? This persecution of God's people. But God is going to take care of them. Now here's what's really interesting about all of this, to me at least. And we're going to jump out of Revelation 12 for just a minute and chase a little bit of a rabbit. Down in verse 9, he tells us that this dragon is the devil, Satan, that ancient serpent. Who is the ancient serpent of the Bible? The devil. But where did we see him at? Where do we see an ancient serpent? In the Garden of Eden. So turn back in your Bibles to Genesis chapter 3. And let's look at this ancient serpent for just a moment. Remember, it was the ancient serpent that tempted the woman to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And she listened to him, and she partook of it, and then she gave some to Adam, and all that happened. And then God comes walking along and has that series of questions and makes them realize where they are and how they got there, and then he starts pronouncing judgment on all of them. But notice what's said in Genesis chapter 3 and verses 14 and 15. This is the what he's going to tell the serpent is his punishment. Genesis 3:14 and 15. The Lord God said to the serpent, because you have done this, cursed are you above all livestock and above all beasts of the field. On your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life. I will put enmity between you and the woman. Well, that seems natural, doesn't it? But here's the line that's interesting. And between your offspring and her offspring. He'll bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. Your offspring, I'm going to put enmity between Satan and the woman, but I'm also going to put enmity between the offspring of the woman, and we would understand who that is, right? But the offspring of Satan, who's that? Well, if you flip over a chapter to Genesis chapter 4 and verse 25. Genesis chapter 4 and verse 25. Adam knew his wife again. This is after Cain and Abel. Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and called his name Seth, for she said, God has appointed for me another offspring instead of Abel, for Cain killed him. Seth was the offspring, her offspring, to replace Abel. Not Cain, but Abel. That's interesting. Especially when you get later on, and he's going to talk about the fact that Cain, because Cain chose the path of selfishness and sin and self, he describes Cain as the offspring of Satan. So there are people that are considered to be the offspring of the woman, those that are choosing the righteous path of God, and then there are those that are considered to be the offspring of Satan that are choosing the path of sin and unrighteousness. Are you with me? Now, flip over to the New Testament, and we're going to get in a time machine and jump way ahead. But jump over to Romans, at the very end of Romans, chapter 16 and verse 20. God told the serpent, I will put enmity between you and the woman, between her offspring and your offspring. You'll bruise his heel, he'll bruise your head. And of course, we often associate that with Jesus, but I think there's more to it than that. In Romans chapter 16 and verse 20, notice what he says. The God of peace will soon crush Satan under your feet. He's writing to Christians in Rome that are, again, under the jurisdiction of the Roman Empire, that are having to go through some stuff because of the Roman Empire. Just like John is writing to Christians that are under the control of the Roman Empire, that are suffering at the hands of the Roman Empire. But he says, the God of peace will soon crush Satan under your feet. Whose feet? These Christians that he's writing to. And then you get off to chapter 12 again of Revelation, and we're going to look ahead. I cheated and I read ahead. But if you look down at Revelation chapter 12 and verse 17, it says, the dragon became furious with the woman and went off to make war on the rest of her offspring. Now, who is that? Out of the children of Israel came the Messiah, Jesus, who was called back up to God and his throne, and he chased the woman, God's people, who was the other offspring of the woman. Well, in verse 17 of Revelation 12, again, you don't have to take my word for it. Revelation explains who this is. He says, on those who kept the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. Who's the offspring? The other offspring of the woman is those that follow Jesus. God's people that follow Jesus. Are you with me? Back in the garden, remember a few weeks ago when we were talking about Genesis and I was talking about this bookends of the Bible. Here's part of that ideology here of the fact that God at the beginning said, I'm going to put enmity, ancient serpent, great red dragon, Satan, devil, between you and the woman, and between her offspring and your offspring. And her offspring are going to be not only Jesus, but the ones that are going to become God's people because of Jesus. Does that make sense? So in other words, what he's telling them in all of this is what Satan really wanted, what the dragon, the devil, really wanted was to destroy Jesus. But he could not destroy Jesus. Couldn't do it. So why am I being persecuted? Why are we having to go there? Because Satan is behind it. He can't get Jesus, so he's trying to get you. Don't let him win. Are you with me? So, back up to verse 6. The woman fled to the wilderness. She's going to be taken care of by God during this persecution process. And then in verse 7, he says, Now war arose in heaven, Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. So this war takes place after Jesus went back to heaven. You've got on one side the dragon and his angels, and on the other side you've got Michael and his angels. And again, this sounds like some fantastic movie that we're watching, of course. Verse 8, But he was defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. So Satan was not strong enough to defeat him. And then, I'm way behind, aren't I? War rose in heaven. They're fighting against Michael and his angels on one side, the dragon and his angels on the other. He was defeated. No longer any place for them in heaven. Verse 9, The dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. So again, that ancient serpent puts you back into the garden. And places like in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, where he talks about just like the serpent deceived Eve by his cunning, I'm afraid you also might be deceived from a pure and sincere devotion to God. The ancient serpent, the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the world. So that's a whole lot to unpack about this dragon. He's the deceiver of the whole world. He tries to make us think that his way is a better way or an easier way or a quicker way, but it's not. You remember when Jesus was tempted by Satan, and where did that take place? In the wilderness. Maybe I'm making all these connections up, I don't know, but in the wilderness. And what did he try to do? He tried to deceive. If you're the Son of God, turn these stones to bread. And takes him up on a high place and says, all of these kingdoms I'll give to you. Well, God had already promised he was going to rule with an iron rod, but it's a shortcut. Brings him up to the pinnacle of the temple. Throw yourself down. He's trying to make it seem as if I'm on your side, buddy. That's what he did with the woman, right? Did God really say you would die when you eat it? You know what really is going to happen is when you eat it, you'll become like God. Wouldn't that be grand? He's deceiving. But he's the devil and Satan. The Hebrew word ha-satan, the Satan, or the accuser, or the adversary. That's really what Satan does, is accuses. Remember when God and Satan are having that discussion about Job? You remember what Satan said about Job? Does Job serve you for nothing? You built this hedge around him. You blessed him. He's done. Basically, he says, God, you have bought his love. And basically, he accuses Job of only being in a relationship with God because of what he can get out of it. He's accusing him. That's what Satan does, is he makes all of these accusations against us. But ultimately, he says he was thrown down to the earth and his angels were thrown down with him. And we could waste a lot of time here. We're not going to. We'll talk a little bit more about it when we get over to chapter 20. But you'll hear people talk a lot about the fall of Satan. And it seems to me like it's more than... It happened in stages. It was more than just a one-time kind of thing, because there was something that happened either in the midst of creation or prior to creation in which Satan became an adversary that would try to tempt Adam and Eve. And then there is another building of that over in Genesis chapter 6 when the sons of God, which is angels, and the daughters of men. There's that one. And then there's, and that one, by the way, is talked about in 2 Peter chapter 2 and in the book of Jude as well. And then there's this one, which is at least the third time that Satan has tried to overthrow God and his army. Then when we get over to chapter 20, at the end of the Roman persecution, he's going to be thrown down again. And then a final time in verse 7. So what does all that mean? I don't know. It just seems to me like there's more than one time that Satan has tried to do this. And anyway, eventually we get to chapter 22, and it's going to be the end of it all for Satan. But anyway, Satan is trying to fight against God, and there's no way he can win. And it's been proven over and over and over and over again. So again, it's another reminder of, why would you want to serve him instead of the God who's going to win? And then we get to verse 10, which is a really key verse. And I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, now, that's key. Underline, put a big star beside, circle. Now, the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come, for the accuser of our brothers has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God. Now, see, Satan's still trying to accuse. That's what he does. We sometimes have this notion that we need to be the Barney Fives of the brotherhood, you know, and that preacher preached that, or that congregation doesn't do that like I think, and I need to write an article, or I need to write a post, or I need to do this, or I need to do that, and we want to accuse people all the time. And we think of it as being a godly thing to do. But biblically speaking, it's a satanic thing to do. It's what Satan means, is accuse. But now that he's been thrown down, after the baby has been born, and after he's been brought back up to God in the throne, and now that the dragon and his angels have been thrown down, now there's salvation and power and a kingdom and authority. All of that has come now. When? After the ascension of Jesus. Because the one who accuses them day and night has been thrown down. And then one last one in verse 11. They have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, for they loved not their lives even unto death. So they, the overcomers, the one who have conquered, remember back in the letters in chapters 2 and 3, he who overcomes will I grant to sit with me in my kingdom. The overcomers, the conquerors, they did so not because of how good they were, but by the blood of Jesus and the word of their testimony. That's how they overcame Satan, was not because of how good I am, but by the blood of the Lamb. So now, Satan can, hey God, that Corey, boy, he's done some stuff, right? He's really messed some things. He can make all kinds of accusations. And he doesn't even have to make up accusations about me. I mean, I've given him a lot of ammunition of real stuff he can accuse me of. But now, God takes the record book here and he says, let's see, Sawyer's Corey, Sawyer's Corey. All I see is blood of the Lamb. Now, how cool is that? So, in this verse, the salvation is now here. The rule of Christ is now here. We can overcome Satan by the blood. We can be faithful unto death. They love not their lives, even to death. They're willing to serve the Lord, even if it means being martyred because of Him, like Antipas in chapter 2, like Jesus in chapter 1. If we're willing to devote ourselves to Him and worship Him, we win. Not because of how good I am, but because of the blood of the Lamb. Now, how cool is that? So at the end of the Arkansas game, we all went, amen. Right? You heard that collective. We were jumping up and down. How many times in the book of Revelation have we seen them? And they praise God, singing songs of praise. Worthy is the Lamb. They're celebrating a victory. And this is the victory. Now you see why I like chapter 12 so much? And we're only halfway through it. So, read Revelation chapter 12, and you might go ahead and read chapter 13, because we might accidentally get into there next Wednesday night, and we will pick up at verse 12 next week. All right, those of you that are online and joining us there, thankful that you are with us online, and hopefully you can be with us in person very soon. While that's all being turned off, we have a few announcements that we want to make those of you that are here in person aware of. And